What is a dominant narrative? Well, dominant narratives are the stories we hear over and over again. They are told from the perspective of privileged social groups and are framed in a way that we typically see white, cis, middle-class values. They are the movies that are more well-known and easy to access. This semester, we watched dominant narratives within each subgenre. These films reinforce widely held ideologies. For example, in the elite prep school genre, characters achieve upward mobility, often through an expression of individualism, usually utilitarian individualism, despite their circumstances. This reaffirms the myth of meritocracy and misses the structural and cultural levels of discrimination. In the suburban high school films, we see characters who are almost always white, heteronormative, and belonging to the middle class. These characters often rebel against adult authority and resist the pressures to conform. They overcome their scripts by finding a unique voice, which is known as expressive individualism. In the urban high school genre, we often see this notion of the white or middle-class savior. These savior figures are almost always white, heteronormative, middle-class individuals who save a group of inner-city students by enabling them to succeed through a push for utilitarian individualism. The implication is often that through hard work, change is possible. This blatantly ignores the structural discrimination which exists and directs our attention onto individual issues. The students in these films are usually people of color who are portrayed as unintelligent, violent, and disobedient people who do not care about school and need to be saved. A lot of the time, these films basically persuade viewers to believe the solution to academic failure is just a nice white lady. In a way, dominant narratives are like single stories. They create frames and produce stereotypes. They also show the differences among people rather than showing the similarities. It is important to recognize that single stories are incorrect and that they give false representations. They can also enforce narrow and uninformed ways of thinking.
So in opposition to these dominant narrative films, we have three good examples here of counter-narrative films. The first one is not actually a film, and it fits this elite genre, but it's more podcast, the 3 Mile podcast, which we feel kind of does a great job of countering the things in the dominant narrative film. So for example, we have multiple stories in this podcast, so the framing is much more realistic, it's much more broad, it's not as narrow, and it's not creating that single story, which we know is harmful. We also are getting some more realistic stories, ones that don't necessarily end well. One of the quotes from the podcast is that it must be a special brand of American pathological optimism that so many of us believe the story of Melanie has to turn out to be happy, and that if it doesn't, something unusual has happened. And I think that that sort of is pointing out that we are conditioned to believe that meritocracy is this thing that we actually have embedded in our society, and that totally ignores the structural and ideological oppression that people face and just focuses again on this individual level. With 3 Mile, we have the story of Melanie, which doesn't end so well, and that's something that I think is a powerful opposition to what we see normally in these films. In the suburban genre, we can look at Pariah and the character of Alike, who faces ideological oppression and structural oppression in the film for being both a person of color and also a person who is not straight. And I think that both of those things separate it from the dominant narrative just in the fact that the protagonist is not a normative, a dominant character. It's someone who has these characteristics which are seen by society as non-normative and thus aren't represented often in these dominant narrative films. And so it actually more accurately addresses the dissonance of expressing yourself, but then society not accepting what you're expressing, rather than saying, yeah, expressive individualism will always work for you, just be yourself, which is, it's more complicated than that. And again, this is usually missing the, ideological level of oppression, the structural level of oppression, and especially in this case, we see that ideological level through Alike's parents, Alike's interactions with other people, that it's not as simple as being straight. And that's a really, really great contrast. In the urban genre, as opposed to having this white savior come in and confirm once again that this is the individual, it is this violent, lazy student that's the problem, and that just, a white savior can come and fix the problem in urban schools. Instead of that, we're getting this perspective that the problem is much bigger, more overarching. There's these scenes where the school board denies to hear their problems. There is a student organization outside of the school, but students organize themselves in order to fight the system through a structural approach using nonviolent protest. And I think that that is a much more realistic picture of both what the problem is, which is ideological, structural, and individual, and what the solution is, which is all three as well. It's none of them exist on any one level, and this film does a much better job of addressing that. And there is a teacher in this film, although he isn't our protagonist, which is a big shift, and the teacher also isn't white. And I think that that's part of this, is that the framing is usually lacking in the normal narratives because it's created by usually white producers, usually male producers for the most part, and it's these Western large companies creating these films, so it's not particularly inclusive of these other ideas, and it doesn't also represent someone who might actually have been there. So when there are these holes that are left in the narrative in terms of someone's, experiences in the world, what they end up filling it in with is the only thing they have, which are these single story stereotypes. And those continue to perpetuate those stereotypes for other people to have them then accessible. And that is, I think the biggest shift with the counter-narrative is you often have a different perspective through the actual character, and hopefully also sometimes you have people making the film and people in the cast who are not all from the dominant culture. And I think that that is a really powerful shift. So we have these myths which are being reinforced with these dominant narratives. And some of those myths, outside of just the kind of meritocracy myths and stuff like that, we also have those blank holes which are being filled in with the stereotypes, the blank holes that are coming from the lack of a complete frame. And those stereotypes and those single stories that come in to fill it in tend to be very harmful, and there's a few really, really powerful examples of that. One of them is a study that was done in Portland State, and this was published in the APA Journal, American Psychological Association. And I'm going to just read a direct quote from the study and then discuss it, because I think this quote is really great. So perhaps surprisingly to some, shooter bias, and this is in reference to the bias to shoot African Americans versus white people in a study where you're shown pictures of both people kind of in quick succession, and it changes the race constantly, and it also changes whether or not they're actually holding a weapon or something that looks kind of like a weapon. And they're basically trying to see how inaccurate are you and how quick are you to shoot in both situations. So the quote is, perhaps surprisingly to some, shooter bias is not related to participants' level of explicit prejudice, and this is determined by Coral et al. 2002, but instead stereotype accessibility, particularly the stereotype that links blacks with criminality, which appears to be the key driver of the effect. And this was, again, found by another study by Coral in 2007. Again, in 2002, the study had also had evidence towards this as well. The basic process unfolds as the black suspect activates and primes the black racial group stereotype and its connected features in the mind of the shooter, which includes perceptions of criminality. This facilitates stereotype-consistent response, for example, shooting an armed black suspect. And it speeds up the processing in those situations. However, it also makes stereotype-consistent errors more likely, as the predisposition to act in line with the stereotype influences behavior. So the idea here is basically that people are more likely, despite the fact that they may claim not to be a racist and believe that they're not a racist, are still biased to shoot faster when they see a black individual holding something that looks like a gun than when they see a white individual holding something that looks like a gun. They shoot faster, and on top of that, they also make more errors, as in they shoot more people who actually weren't holding a gun. In the case of the white pictures, they're actually slower to shoot, and they make less errors. So this has massive implications, especially the fact that this is directly linked to stereotype accessibility. Because what those dominant narratives do is they reinforce the accessibility of those stereotypes in the mind of the watcher or listener. And that's why the counter-narrative is so important, because it comes in and it gives us an opportunity to empathize with someone other than the normative white, cis, male, character who is dominant in all these films and always kind of coming up. And when we see these characters who are African-American, people of color, especially, for example, in the urban films, they're portrayed as being violent. And so you can see how that sort of reinforcing of a subconscious stereotype, it doesn't matter whether you believe something or not, that reinforcing actually has an impact on the way you behave. And so that could also have implications when it comes to job bias and school discipline reports, like in terms of hiring people, in terms of giving people detention, stuff like that, which can lead to later on having more issues. And that's kind of also reinforced by these trials that were done related to sentencing, showing that people are more likely to give longer sentences to people who have darker skin. And so that, these facts are we know that there are these biases in society, and now we can identify that part of that has to do with the accessibility of the stereotypes. And we know that the more we hear something, the more we are conditioned to have accessibility to it, the more those, those areas in our brain are myelinated. So we literally are conditioning ourselves by watching these dominant narrative films to believe these stereotypes, whether we actually believe it or not. Even if we're watching it through a lens, we're still being conditioned. So that's why it's so important to have these counter narratives which don't do as much of this conditioning and provide alternate lenses to create a bigger picture for people overall as they watch more and more counter narratives, and also for people to empathize with people other than those dominant characters, and to have different ideas about the non-dominant characters, and to start to have more than just one story.